a human rights lawyer like Keir Starmer, who I think will meet himself coming around a corner one day. So I don't like him, I don't respect him, I think he's a very poor Prime Minister. And I personally think Keir Starmer is extremely duplicitous. I think this is a duplicitous way to lead your life.
Rupert Lowe humiliated Keir Starmer on live TV by saying the quiet part out loud: Britain has a Prime Minister who cannot escape his own record. Lowe called him economical with the truth, branded him a poor Prime Minister, and said he would back him resigning because Starmer's Serious Man Act is collapsing under basic scrutiny.
Looking at Starmer and looking at the Labour front bench and looking at what's happened over the last 20 or 30 years, well, really since Tony Blair, and I think, how have the British people been hoodwinked by this system that basically serves them up a slate of people from parties that they don't respect, they don't like, they don't want to vote for. So these people...
And honestly, how is Starmer supposed to answer that? With another careful statement, another technical excuse? Another line about process and responsibility while the country watches another scandal crawl out of the walls? Lowe did not need to shout. He just placed Starmer's judgment on the table and let everyone stare at it. That is what made it brutal. Starmer sells himself as serious, stable, boringly competent. Then Lowe comes along and says the serious man cannot even inspire basic trust.
These people have actually left voting. And as you know, in the last election, I think the turnout was only 59%. As I call it, Keir Starmer's landslip election victory. That's what it was. It's wafer thin, actually, if you dig.
The Mandelson mess is exactly why this hits so hard. Peter Mandelson was already a walking political alarm bell before Starmer put him anywhere near power again. Lowe says he opposed the appointment at the time because Mandelson had been rude about Donald Trump, and Trump had already described him in ugly terms.
Donald Trump described him as a moron. He was rude about Donald Trump. So on the face of it, at the time, it was the most extraordinary appointment, and one which didn't make any logical common sense.
So why would Starmer look at Britain's most important international relationship and decide, yes, this is the man I need? How does that make sense unless Starmer's idea of judgment is just recycling old Blairite furniture?
They know nothing. And these are the people making the decisions. These are the people who are trying to hold the civil service to account. Ministers are supposed to basically decide and advisors advise. But if the ministers don't know what they're deciding about, they can't hold the other people to account. So
then we get the vetting issue. Lowe said Ollie Robbins made it clear that the Prime Minister's office made the decision, and civil servants had to find a way to deliver it, even though Mandelson had failed vetting. The government line was basically that Starmer and ministers did not know about the vetting advice, and once informed, Starmer ordered officials to establish the facts. Brilliant. So either Starmer knew and looked slippery, or he did not know and looks asleep at the wheel. Pick your disaster.
I was saying, look, this is the last Labour government we're ever going to see. Thank God.
Yeah, I think it is. I think this
really
is the end
think
of the Labour Party. They are a farce. I mean, the people in Parliament are a farce. The MPs are a farce.
That is the real problem with Starmer. Every scandal turns into a fog machine. Nobody is responsible. Nobody knew. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody in charge can simply say, yes, I made the decision. Starmer spent years acting like he was the cleanup crew after Tory chaos. But the moment the spotlight hits his own operation, suddenly we are all drowning in careful wording, half answers, and official statements. Lowe called it out because millions of people already feel it. Starmer's government sounds controlled, but it does not feel honest.
If I was forced to vote on whether he should resign, I would vote for him to resign. But half of me says actually leaving him there as a lame duck is probably better for the other parties in terms of the British public becoming tired of the Labour Party.
And let's talk about that famous Starmer landslide, because Lowe ripped the shine right off it. Starmer walks around with a huge majority like the country threw rose petals at his feet. Lowe mocked it as wafer thin. Jacob Rees-Mogg pointed out that Starmer won his majority on just 35% of the vote share. Lowe also pointed to turnout being only 59%. That means Starmer's giant mandate is built on a country where a massive chunk of voters stayed home, and millions looked at the menu and chose political starvation.
He loses most of the seats. In fact, I don't see how Labour can ever survive what's been happening again. I think this is the end of the Labour Party.
So when Starmer acts like Britain gave him some historic moral permission slip, people should laugh. A 35% vote share is not national love. It is electoral math doing overtime. Lowe said a 10% shift away from Labour could cost Starmer most of his seats. That is the part Labour hates hearing. Their majority looks like a castle from far away, but Lowe is saying the foundations are made of damp cardboard. Starmer is not sitting on deep loyalty. He is sitting on borrowed patience.
In terms of the British public becoming tired of the Labour Party and tired of the offering which he's giving the Chagos Islands away, all of the things that are completely illogical. So I think, to your point there, I wasn't in the chamber. If I'm forced to vote on it, I would support a vote of no confidence.
Great Yarmouth made that point even louder. Lowe's side won 10 out of 10 seats, 9 county council seats, and 1 borough council by-election. That was not a little protest wobble. That was a clean sweep. Turnout was 60% higher than the same vote in 2021. Across the wards, turnout was around 47%, compared with roughly 30% in 2021. The average vote share was about 46%. Those numbers matter because they show people who had checked out are walking back in.
As you know, Keir Starmer won his majority on a 35% share of the vote.
That's right, but if you take the turnout of the last election was just under 70%. It had fallen off. Actually, 2019 was 70%.
Well, there's a lot of people who haven't voted.
30%. If you got all of those 30% to vote, which is inconceivable because even in the 1950s we were only getting up to an 80% voter level. But
that is what should terrify Starmer. Lowe is saying he is not simply taking votes from conservatives or reform. He is bringing back voters who had given up on the whole rotten show. Around 500 volunteers came on the Friday, around 400 on election day, and even critics had to admit hundreds were on the ground. People came from Inverness, Aberdeen, Glasgow, Liverpool, Leeds, Devon, Cornwall, Sussex, and the Midlands. Starmer has the machine. Lowe had people willing to travel, knock doors, and fight.
Tell me, what is Restore's view of the current political situation? The Prime Minister fighting for his political life, the Mandelson scandal, and a civil service that could possibly be doing the right thing or one that's utterly out of control. Where is Restore on that?
Basically, a Prime Minister who, in my view, is economical with the truth. I think, let's talk about Mandelson. On the Mandelson issue, I spoke against the appointment of Mandelson at the time.
Starmer's biggest problem is not just that Rupert Lowe roasted him on television. His bigger problem is that Lowe connected Starmer to the real pain people actually feel. Taxes up, national insurance up, more rules, more lectures, more laws from people who act like running a country is the same as managing a complaints department. Lowe's point was simple. Labour is strangling real Britain. And when you look at how Starmer governs, that is not even a dramatic line anymore. That is the business model.
I think it would be for us manna from heaven if he were to resign or any of the others were to resign. It's a perfect time for us to be fighting by-elections. So arguably an own goal by the Labour Party, but I think it's a matter for them.
That explains so much about Starmer. He looks like a man who can recite the procedure but cannot feel the country. He sounds controlled but not connected. Lowe talked about reverse Darwinism, where the weakest people make the biggest decisions. Brutal, yes, but look at the results. A state that takes more, spends more, regulates more, and still cannot deliver basic trust. Lowe said the state accounts for at least 50% of GDP when you include indirect state bodies, half the economy touched by government gravity, and somehow the public still gets excuses, delays, scandals, and lectures.
What our system has done is created this genetic pool of almost reverse Darwinism, where we have the weakest people making the biggest decisions. And gradually what's happened is the state has accreted power to the extent that it accounts for at least 50% of GDP if you take all the sort of indirect state bodies.
Then Lowe went after policy, border control, a big economic paper, energy, net zero, North Sea oil and gas, inheritance tax, VAT threshold. He said Restore would scrap IHT because it raises relatively little but damages families, farms, and businesses. This is where Starmer looks especially exposed. Labor talks about fairness while creating pressure that forces people to sell what their families built. Lowe's argument is that Britain needs to release productive people, not punish them until BlackRock or some faceless giant picks up the pieces.
Neither the Prime Minister nor any government minister was aware that Peter Mandelson was granted developed vetting against the advice of UK security vetting until earlier this week. Once the Prime Minister was informed, he immediately instructed officials to establish the facts about why the developed vetting was granted in order to enact plans to update the House of Commons.
And that brings us back to Starmer. Rupert Lowe humiliated him because he did not just call him useless and move on. He explained the structure underneath the failure. Weak mandate, rotten judgment, Mandelson chaos, a 35% vote share government acting like it owns the country, a political class that knows nothing, a state swallowing at least half the economy, local elections showing people coming back, Restore branches spreading, volunteers moving. Starmer can pretend this is noise, but the numbers say something else. The country is starting to look for the exit.